This soldier survived something no human should. Not a bullet, not a shell, but the slow, unbearable realization that the machinery of modern war could be undone by one thing: lack of fuel. It was still before dawn on December 17, 1944, when Joachim Peiper climbed down from the idle turret of his Tiger and stood with frozen breath fogging in the pre-dawn cold. The engine had died an hour earlier, a sterile hush replacing the low iron growl that had been the constant companion of men and machines for months. He looked out over the small clearing at Hansfeld and saw a sight that for a brief, vertiginous moment felt like providence. Rows upon rows of jerry cans glinted in the weak light, stacked like an obscene crop on a battlefield that had, until then, been wholly backward for gasoline. The metal reeked, not the thin, metallic tang of winter air alone, but the heavy, cloying smell of petrol. Men began to move with the clumsy joy of men who believe they have been handed victory. Pump crews unrolled hoses, mechanics wrestled with caps, fuel siphoned into tanks, and armored cars that had been stalled for days took on life again. For a commander whose advance depended on momentum and range, a captured supply point such as this promised a second wind. For a few hours, the tactical problem of empty tanks seemed momentarily solved. But the elation was brittle. Papers and manifests found among the stacks told a different story. Newspapers dated days earlier, stars and stripes fresh from rear echelons, lay with delivery slips and trucking manifests that traced the fuel's journey across liberated Europe. The handwriting on the convoy documents, the stamped dates from supply depots, the names of American railheads, they were small, bureaucratic proofs of a much larger reality. This was not a lucky find at the edge of a collapsing supply line. It was a thread in a vast, well-oiled network. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German non-commissional officer captured later and questioned about that morning, would recall reading manifests and recognizing routing markers that made one fact clear: the fuel they had seized at Hansfeld had come from far behind the Allied front, fed through newly liberated ports, pipelines, and trucking routes. Records indicate roughly 50,000 gallons at that forward point, a considerable catch for a hungry Kampfgruppe, but a sliver compared to what the Allies could and did move. The Ardennes offensive, the Germans' last gamble to split Allied lines and push to the Meuse, had been launched with promises of dramatic rates of advance. But planners at the highest level confronted an uncomfortable arithmetic. German tanks were mechanically formidable, but thirstily dependent on liquid fuel. German petroleum picture in 1944 was dim by comparison. German production, including synthetic output, amounted to only a few tens of millions of barrels for the year. Allied production dwarfed it by orders of magnitude.
Allied records show U.S. petroleum production on the order of roughly 1.8 billion barrels that year. German figures were measured in the tens of millions. Such numbers were not abstract. They translated directly into range tables on the backs of tank crews' hands and into the rusting skeletons of armored formations stranded on icy roads. From the Allied perspective, logistics had ceased to be merely support for combat. Logistics was combat. Since the liberation of the Normandy Lodgment, American planners had built an unrivaled network to feed forward combat power. Pipelines from coast to capital, railheads turned into arterial feeders, and the famous Red Ball Express, a mostly African-American truck convoy system that ran day and night to shuttle fuel and supplies from Cherbourg and other ports eastward. There was also Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean that, though limited in its early days, symbolized an industrial mindset: supply by any means necessary. By mid-December, in the Northwest European theater, daily Allied fuel consumption ran into the millions of gallons. First Army records indicate receipts on the order of 1.8 million gallons per day at times. Theater-wide consumption approached several million gallons daily, figures that made local captures like Hansfeld pale by comparison. For men like Peiper, the discovery at Hansfeld was a mixed blessing. If a few hundred tanks could be refueled, a punch might be delivered that would exploit a temporary gap. But the manifest suggested the Americans had backup. That realization moved through a camp group like a chill wind. Tactical triumphs, captured trucks, seized stockpiles, ceased to feel decisive when they were measured against a logistics machine whose scale ran orders of magnitude larger. You could win a firefight and still lose a war because the adversary could outproduce the battlefield. The timeline of December 17 itself is a ledger of contradicted expectations. As Peiper's men celebrated, other events were unfolding with grim immediacy. That same morning, units from his camp group were implicated in the murder of American prisoners near Bagnes. The atrocity at Malmedy, later judged a war crime beyond calculation. The massacre was, in every sense, part of the offensive's chaotic reality: violence, breakdown of discipline, the erosion of norms under the pressure of a desperate drive. The crime would later be factored into legal proceedings against Peiper and his subordinates. It also cast an ethical shadow over any tactical gains made that day. On the Allied side, commanders watched the German spearhead with something more clinical than panic: a calculation. If enemy forces seized forward fuel dumps, the conventional response of troops in the field, and the one ordered by American engineering officers, was not to attempt to recover and use those supplies if that risked giving the enemy more fuel than they could reasonably carry away.
When recapture was uncertain, the policy favored denial. Colonel James Snyder and Brigadier General Morris Gillen would later frame this as calculated attrition of materiel, destroying stockpiles to prevent them from tipping local operational balances. That policy would be enacted in stark, incendiary fashion over the next days. At Stavelot, only a short march from Hansfeld, American engineers and infantry found themselves with convoys and depots threatened by the German advance. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion later reported being ordered to deny the German forces forward access to fuel. What followed was not theater. It was a decision made coldly and executed with a grenade and a fuse. Technical Sergeant Paul Salas, an enlisted engineer whose testimony surfaces in after-action reports, later described the first grenade arcing into a cabinet of drums. Flames took hold like a physical law. Oil and petrol do not burn politely. They explode into columns of black that devour oxygen and light like a hungry animal. Witnesses, German and American alike, recorded the sound as a rising roar. Night and day were erased from a horizon by a column of smoke so dense it turned the sky into a shroud. Men on both sides watched as millions of gallons in that week were consumed in deliberate denial operations, a figure military reports would later place in the low millions for Stavelot alone, and roughly 8 million gallons destroyed across several sites in the opening days of the Ardennes. For those on the ground with Peiper, the enormity of what the Americans would burn became a new, cruel arithmetic. At Hansfeld, they had rejoiced over perhaps 50,000 gallons. At Stavelot, they watched a cathedral of flame that consumed perhaps 2 million gallons in a single depot. Across the theater, the tally mounted. The ratio was telling. A good tactical capture could not offset theater-scale disposal and replenishment. The Germans had resources, the Allies had logistics. It is tempting to frame this as moral or symbolic theater, the righteous denying fuel to a hated foe, but such language misses the strategic calculus. Denial served a function. A fuel dump in enemy hands could become a springboard for further operations. An intact supply might allow German armor to extend its reach. By burning millions of gallons, Allied commanders accepted a costly immediate loss to prevent a potentially greater operational disaster. For the men whose only mathematics was mileage per gallon, though, those burning hills of black smoke looked like burning mountains of opportunity turned to ash. Peiper's reaction to the flames was not theatrical. He was a professional officer, obsessed with timing, roads, and bridges. His initial optimism about refueling shifted into a precise, bitter appraisal. Fuel was not merely a supply item, it was the sinew of mechanized warfare. Tanks did not advance on morale alone. A tank without fuel is an inert monument. A division without gas is a casualty in paperwork and in rubber and steel left to freeze on the roadside. As the flames at Stavelot rose higher, reality intruded in other, quieter ways. Narrow Ardennes lanes funneled traffic, abandoned vehicles clogged routes. Every minute of delay burned fuel in engines idling, clutches slipping, crews huddled against cold. The winter road became a trap. The more you tried to move, the more fuel you squandered. A captured depot promised respite until the road holding the pipe and the convoy network could not provide the quick turnover needed. Supply was not a static cache, it was motion, timing, and protected lines.
The men could see the outline of the logic, and, like men watching an enemy artillery barrage, had no clear shelter. Interrogations and diaries from the period show the psychological effect on officers. Where men had once believed in the purifying heroics of tactical prowess, a bold thrust here, a daring bypass there, a new, humiliating calculus set in. The soldier's romantic image of war, the idea of decisive maneuvers and heroic conquests, crashed headlong into spreadsheets and manifest numbers. Tactical audacity floundered when your mechanized teeth were dulled by a lack of the necessary grease. Even as crews cheered the temporary flow of gasoline into tanks, an officer who understood the cradle-to-frontline logic of Allied logistics could see that this was a stopgap, not salvation. This was not merely an engineering or arithmetic problem, it was a psychological rupture. For a calm group of commander, that instant when you can smell the gasoline and know that more of it is being poured onto a fire miles away is akin to a man watching ice melt around his feet while the tide comes in. There is a slow, dawning horror in the understanding that your best tactical opportunities are ephemeral when measured against industrial capacity. The American logistical machine was not perfect. Convoys broke down, roads froze, and mistakes were made. But mistakes were not systemic. Production and movement were continuous. While German synthetic plants sputtered under Allied bombing and the fuel rationing that had become the backdrop to every campaign choice, the Allies were feeding a seemingly endless line of trucks and pipelines. The arithmetic showed the margin. Even with deliberate destruction to prevent capture, the Allies could sustain operations in a way the Germans could not match. That day in Hansfeld, though, numbers were as much a personal wound as they were strategic data. Peiper ordered his men to siphon whatever they could. Some tanks lapped up fuel and roared into action, only to stall miles later because fuel trucks could not be secured for the long promise of advance. Whole companies would in the coming days be forced to abandon vehicles that had been modern marvels just hours earlier.
A tiger without gas was an anachronism. A panther cut short by shortage was a hulking testament to mismatch. The first week of the Ardennes would be defined by these contrasts in dramatic, painful detail. The stories from the ground are full of small tableaus that add up to a larger thesis. Men pushing and shoving, mechanics covered in grease, lines at pumps, eyes scanning the road for drifting black smoke where another depot had been burned mere hours before. Even victories tasted of rationing, even captures felt like crumbs. And then the orders came down for more burnings. In command posts, the latitude to deny became policy. American engineers, facing the choice between leaving supplies intact for recapture or destroying them to starve a spearhead, chose denial repeatedly. They walked into depots with fuses and torches because they had, in their estimate, to prevent the enemy from using assets that could mean a breakthrough. It was a grim calculus with a grimly effective logic. At Stavelot, the sky turned a color men in uniform do not often recall, a thick purple where smoke and flame outstripped the palette of winter twilight. Flames licked at stacks of drums, a heat so intense warped metal and sent riveted lids twisting off like Madeleine lids in a storm. Witnesses later wrote of animals and birds fleeing in erratic patterns, of sheets of flame reflected in puddles of petrol. For a soldier watching, the scene was apocalyptic and deeply mechanistic at once, an industrial engine being deliberately disabled by burning its own fuel. The Germans watched and could not quickly retaliate. Trucks jammed the lanes that might have carried replacement stocks. Bridges, frozen and sometimes shelled, could not be relied upon. When a column halted for lack of fuel, it became an island. Artillery could shell it, patrols could harass it, and the men within would feel their ability to act evaporate. In small talk among infantrymen, the contrast would be rendered in human terms. They have pumps and pipelines, we have cans and a prayer. It might sound like bitter humor, and it was, but it was accurate. The war had become measured in gallons and miles per gallon, in the number of barrels that could be produced, brought ashore, and shoveled forward by drivers and engineers. That morning at Hansfeld, Peiper did not yet see the full strategic picture in its cold final form. He saw the fuel and thought in terms of the next maneuver. He also knew, with a professional's grimness, that his gains were fragile. A stars and stripes tucked among the manifests whispered of an enemy who replaced losses with a pace and scale his force could not match.
By midday, the smell of petrol mingled with a bitter, metallic tang of panic. Men began to calculate not only the miles ahead, but the miles behind, supply lines that were long, vulnerable, and dependent on factors outside any single commander's control.
For a short while, the episode remained a localized story of scarce men and stolen gas, but other events were about to fold into it and make Hansfeld not an anecdote, but an emblem. Reports of other depots destroyed, radioed messages about burned convoys, and the slow clogging of Ardennes lanes would coalesce into an operational pattern. Where the enemy could not secure and move supplies forward, the Allies would deny them the resource. The scale of denial, the millions of gallons burned in those opening days, would rewrite the calculus of the offensive. Yet even with the arithmetic clear, there were human consequences that numbers could not soften. Wounded men waited on sleds with suits of ice crusted to blankets. Drivers who had planned on long runs found themselves walking beside ruined tires and gutted engines. Vehicles that had been the symbols of martial prowess lay in rows like shipwrecks on an icebound shore. The psychological impact was profound. To fight and feel the engine cough and die was to experience a new form of defeat. Not defeat by enemy fire, but defeat by absence. In the command tent that afternoon, Sepp Dietrich and other senior officers received reports that would cause discussions to harden into ominous reality. Hassel von Montefel's later comments would frame these events as the point where operational ambitions collided with logistical impotence. For the men in the field, these were not abstractions. They were measurements of distance between victory and collapse. And yet, even as depots burned and despair thickened on the roads, the human impulse toward action did not vanish. Peiper reorganized columns, issued orders to conserve fuel, prioritized forward units for whatever gasoline could be wrested from captured depots or siphoned from abandoned trucks. It was a breathtaking exercise in triage. Who would get the last liters? Which vehicle was indispensable, and which would be left to the cold? Around dusk, as black smoke bloomed farther along the horizon, radio traffic shifted from taut coordination to fretful queries. A message here, a failed rendezvous there, and the underlying arithmetic tightened like a vice. The American decision to burn, judged by some contemporaries as extravagant, was instead a defensive policy. Do not let the enemy transform your logistical strength into their operational lever. When night fell, the burned depots still smoldered. Their silhouettes were visible for miles, a map of denial markers across the rear of the theater. For Joachim Peiper, for the men who had poured petrol into their tanks that morning at Hansfeld, the scene was a bitter teacher. In the below-zero dark, men who had tasted temporary vindication now felt a different hunger, the hunger for a supply line that could outpace a war waged by factories, ships, and pipelines. That hunger would dictate the coming days. The advance would choke, then fray. Tanks that had been feared across Europe were left to rust by the side of the road. Whole companies walked back to friendly lines. The machinery of war, for all its metal and thunder, proved as fragile as the paper manifests that documented the enemy's strength. Numbers did not lie. A few captured tens of thousands of gallons could not counter the deliberate destruction of millions, nor could they offset months, decades of industrial production advantages. But the story at Hansfeld was not yet finished. The flames at Stavelot were a roar in the distance, but news travels in the winter with peculiar speed and distortion. Radio reports would soon arrive to confirm the scale of destruction, and orders would come down to scramble for what little remained. Men would call out names, check lists, and try to make sense of a day that turned a tactical windfall into a symptom of strategic defeat. For the soldiers, the arithmetic of industry and the cruelty of policy would become a personal memory they carried like a stone. If this is the kind of story that grips you, the clash between human daring and the cold logic of logistics, stay with us for the next part of this series, where we trace how this denial policy, together with Allied production and pipeline networks, turned into the decisive factor that stalled the Ardennes offensive and sent entire formations back to foot marches and frozen encampments. Night deepened. Around the distant rim of the smoke, silhouettes of abandoned tanks and half-loaded trucks outlined a landscape of halted motion. Men gathered in small clusters, sharing cigarettes and thin blankets, talking low about the day's strange ironies, how a smell of gasoline could so briefly lift their hopes, and how quickly those hopes could be consumed by fire. Somewhere beyond the line of sight, the engineer who had thrown that first grenade would later describe how the fuse lit, how the first drums blew, and how the depot became an all-consuming pyre. The flames were a signal as much as a spectacle. The war was being decided not only by guns and bravery, but by pipes, wheels, and the ability to move petrol in vast quantities. At dawn, the landscape would be different again. Debris and ash would mark where supplies had once been. Convoys would try new routes. Men who had joined the offensive with the smell of gasoline in their nostrils would now carry a different scent, the acrid tang of smoke, and the metallic aftertaste of a strategic reckoning. The image of a Tiger tank with its hatch open and an empty fuel gauge would linger in photographs and testimony. The monument of steel would be reduced to a silhouette of potential. For Peiper and for others, surviving that morning meant living through a realization. The modern battlefield had become the domain of those who could produce and move fuel at scale. Their tactical skill mattered, but not enough.
Dawn did not bring relief so much as an arithmetic. Roads clogged, gauges empty, and the cold that had bitten men in the morning seemed now to sharpen into something like consequence. Over the next 48 hours, the Ardennes became a landscape of halted motion. Columns that had once thundered forward were choked where narrow lanes narrowed further under the weight of abandoned trucks and knocked-out vehicles. Engine noise gave way to a staccato of cursed words and the clank of tracks as crews tried, and too often failed, to coax life from fuel-starved motors. Peiper moved among these small tragedies with a commander's economy of words. He reallocated the scant liters that could be scavenged, prioritized lead vehicles that might still break through, and ordered mechanics to strip jerry cans and pumps from anything that could be spared. Every decision was triage. The question was not where to strike, but which units to let live and which to consign to immobility. In the field, this looked like a series of private amputations, a panther left by a hedgerow, a Sterngeschütz pushed off the road and abandoned with tracks smoked by long idling, a transport whose cargo of men was piled into a ditch to lighten weight so other vehicles could attempt a short, hopeless sprint. Even for men who had been trained to accept loss, seeing a Tiger with its hatch open and an empty gauge became a new kind of humiliation. Photographs taken in the days after the offensive show rows of silent monsters, their turrets turned toward indifferent sky. To a public unaccustomed to the arithmetic of supply, these images read as mere defeat. To officers who spent months calculating range cards and fuel tables, they were proof. Metallurgy and bravery could be neutralized by the simple mismatch between production and consumption. Those tactical scenes were mirrored by operational disruptions. Bridges and open roads had always been the arteries of mechanized warfare. In the Ardennes, a single overturned truck or a crashed tank could create an hour of delay that translated into hundreds of gallons lost to idling and rerouting. The steep, forested terrain meant convoys had to single file. The loss of a single transport was not an isolated waste, but a net bankleness that rippled through the supply chain. The Allied denial policy amplified this effect. Burned depots meant longer hauls from intact dumps and more opportunities for mechanical failure and human error. American logistics officers tallied the cost and saw it differently. Where an infantry colonel viewed burned fuel as a moral or political loss, logistics specialists saw a defensive payoff. Destroying a depot that might otherwise have enabled a breakthrough was an investment, painful in the short term, but preventing a potentially far costlier collapse. Records from engineer units and after-action reports underline the scale of the choice.
Captain John Brewster's actions at Stavelot were grimly utilitarian, to blow a drum and deny fuel to approaching armor. Technical Sergeant Paul Sullis, who lit the first fuse in one account, described not triumph, but a professional task carried out under orders. The explosion and subsequent conflagration were not triumphal scenes so much as the enactment of an arithmetic. The flames themselves left an imprint beyond the battlefield. Smoke columns were visible for miles, disorienting pilots and covering radios in greasy soot. Civilians in nearby hamlets watched supply points turn to furnace. Their astonishment was compounded when Allied forces, the liberators months earlier, destroyed their own stockpiles. Local newspapers later described towns ringed by black curtains of smoke, a man-made storm that blurred the line between supply and sacrifice. For soldiers, the sight had another effect. It made the enemy's capacity visible in a way that manifests and numbers could not. If the American logistics system was an abstraction before, the Stavelo fire made it palpably real, enormous enough to be seen and smelled and catalogued. Operationally, the consequences were immediate and harsh. Units that might have been capable of continued thrusts found themselves stationary. Tanks that had charged through hedgerows and over culverts now sat idle as infantry partners scoured for jerry cans and scavenged radiator hoses. Combat reports show an increasing number of walkers, men abandoning vehicles and marching back to lines with heavy packs. Medical evacuations suffered similarly. Ambulances without fuel could not carry the wounded, and the cold that seeped into dressings and skin became another casualty of the fuel shortage. At higher command levels, the arithmetic hardened into strategic reality. Communications became a constant ledger of deficits, requests for fuel that could not be fulfilled, priority memos from Corps headquarters deciding which divisions would receive the scarce leaders. German planners worried not only about immediate reach toward the Meuse, but about the longer term. If a spearhead could not be resupplied, it would become an isolated salient that Allied forces could encircle or harass into irrelevance. The Allied logistical apparatus, by contrast, absorbed loss differently. Even after deliberate denial, theater-wide delivery networks kept moving. The Red Ball Express provides a striking image in this calculus, a daytime and nighttime surge of cabbies, mechanics, and drivers who by sheer human labor replaced barrels and cans with a flood of rubber and metal. Where German supply hinged increasingly on captured stocks and fragile synthetic production, Allied logistics had diversified, berths in multiple ports, pipelines like Pluto pushing fuel inland, and an industrial base that in sheer scale dwarfed Germany's.
To translate that into numbers, theater-wide consumption in Northwest Europe reached into the millions of gallons per day in December 1944. First Army registers indicate receipts often in the neighborhood of 1.8 million gallons per day. Broader theater demands pushed that figure much higher, to several million gallons daily. Across the Atlantic, U.S. petroleum production in 1944 amounted to approximately 1.8 billion barrels. German petroleum, including synthetic output, measured in the tens of millions of barrels for the year, figures sometimes cited around the low 30s of millions. Those orders of magnitude differences were not abstract bookwork. They were the difference between an army that could sustain continuous operations and one forced to pick and choose engagements based on scarcity. The confrontations that followed reflected this arithmetic. In multiple sectors, the German spearhead found its operational window narrow to a sliver. Even where tactical successes were achieved, local breakthroughs, roadblocks bypassed, the inability to hold and exploit those gains turned them into Pyrrhic victories. Vehicles were left to the weather and enemy fire, tools and spare parts were lost in the shuffle, the casualties that could not be evacuated added to the human toll of logistical failure. Psychologically, the effect on men and commanders was corrosive. Junior officers who had been inculcated with a doctrine of audacity found their initiative undermined by an unseen enemy, the supply chart. Men who had once measured success in kilometers gained were now measuring success by the number of liters remaining in last cans. Morale, always dependent on both physical condition and belief in purpose, frayed under slow, cumulative stress. Some soldiers reacted with anger and scapegoating, others with a shocked fatalism. For an elite like Kampfgruppe Peiper, which had prided itself on mobility and shock, seeing columns of its own equipment immobilized by lack of fuel struck at the core of identity. And yet, even amid these practical disasters, the offensive continued for a while longer, propelled by momentum and by the stubbornness of men who had invested months of planning and lives into the gamble. Small units fought on, engineers worked through the night to jury-rig pumps, drivers who might have known better risked runs to salvage a cache. But the trend was evident. Attrition by absence rather than attrition by fire. The enemy was being worn down by the denial of the one input the great engines of war could not do without. The Ardennes did not collapse overnight. Weather, the tenacity of individual formations, and the unsuitability of the terrain for rapid exploitation slowed definitive outcomes. Yet, by the end of the month, the offensive had lost its momentum. The Germans were pushed back from many of their positions. Objectives, including significant parts of the Meuse advance, were never achieved.
The operational lesson was ruthlessly clear to professional observers. In industrialized war, logistical superiority can turn tactical opportunity into a non-factor. In the months that followed, the personal consequences for those most closely identified with the offensive would wander into the realm of legal reckoning and human retribution. The Malmedy massacre, already a shadow on the campaign, became a focal point of Allied legal proceedings. Joachim Peiper was among those arrested and tried. Courts concluded that elements under his command had committed gross violations of the laws of war. The trials that followed led to sentences that, in the complexity of post-war politics and appeals, were later commuted and reduced for some. Peiper spent years in custody after conviction and was eventually released in 1956. Public memory would long link his tactical persona with the moral stain of the massacre, complicating any narrative that sought to present him solely as a gifted maneuver commander. His life after release was not that of a triumphant return. He settled in civilian Europe, attempting to live quietly in the shadow of what history had recorded. In 1976, decades after the Ardennes, his life ended violently. His home was set ablaze, and he perished in the fire. The perpetrators were not definitively identified. The case remains clouded by claims and counterclaims that did not yield a conclusive public accounting. That unresolved ending, an engineer of a brutal offensive dying in a privately lit pyre, offers its own kinds of closure and ambiguity. It is a personal coda that resonates with the larger story. Those who command machines of war often find their own fate caught in complex, morally ambiguous nets. But the narrative worth holding is not merely the biography of a single commander. The episode at Hansfeld and the infernos at Stavelot frame a larger, unavoidable lesson about modern war. Victory increasingly belonged to those who could feed engines at scale, to those whose factories, docks, and pipelines could turn production into forward movement. Tactical skill remained valuable, but it was insufficient when faced with a logistical system of industrial proportions. Historians who have re-examined the Ardennes in the decades since point to a confluence of factors that made the German gamble doomed: insufficient fuel, inadequate reserves, the Allied advantage in production, and the determined use of denial tactics. The numbers reinforce the narrative. Estimates of fuel destroyed in the opening days of the offensive place the figure in the millions of gallons, Stavelot accounting for roughly 2 million in one depot, and cumulative destruction across the theater near 8 million gallons in the first critical week. Those losses, paired with Allied consumption and replenishment rates, made it next to impossible for German armored units to maintain the tempo needed for a strategic breakthrough.
There is, too, a cultural element to the story. The end of a certain kind of romanticism about maneuver warfare. The image of the commander who, with audacity and a few men, can turn a battle, receded in the face of logistical analysis. Warfare in the mid-20th century had matured into an industrial contest between nations as much as a clash between soldiers. Factories, shipping lanes, and fuel pipelines had weight as decisive as any general's courage. In that sense, what Peiper and his men survived was a cognitive shock, the realization that the tempo of modern conflict is set by production curves and supply lines, not only by battlefield ferocity. The human cost of that realization was real and often tragic. The Ardennes offensive produced casualties, prisoners, and civil suffering that cannot be reduced to numbers alone. War crimes, like Malmedy, remained a moral wound that demanded legal response. Civilians who saw their towns encircled by flames could not be consoled by strategic logic. For soldiers in the field, a cold calculus of gallons and miles provided no balm for frostbitten toes, or for the comrades they could not evacuate because an ambulance had no fuel. Yet the strategic lesson had tangible follow-ons. Allied logistics would continue to be a model of wartime innovation, organizing fuel distribution by priority, building redundancy into supply chains, and ensuring that destruction as denial was an option when necessary. Post-war military doctrine across nations absorbed the Ardennes lessons. Logistics planning moved from being a staff function to being recognized as a strategic instrument. Military schools taught how pipelines, port throughput, and truck hire could determine campaign success as surely as the quality of tanks or planes. For Peiper personally, that strategic shift mattered little in his last months in the Ardennes. He had to confront immediate realities: men to move, maps to read, fuel to find. But his experience, and that of thousands of others, became part of the institutional memory that reshaped how armies thought about supply.
Their bitter, frost-stiffened lessons informed later Cold War planning, where lines of communication and the ability to sustain a front for weeks rather than days were given preeminence. In considering the moral frame of the story, it's essential to be unambiguous. The burning of fuel depots, while a strategic decision, did not and cannot erase or excuse the atrocity at Malmedy. Denial policies are instruments of warfare, but they sit apart from criminal acts against prisoners and civilians. The post-war trials that assigned guilt and punishment testify to this separation. Strategic necessity does not permit war crimes, and the legal system sought, imperfectly and contentiously, to uphold that distinction.
If there is a final, quiet image that brings together the human, the mechanical, and the industrial, it is this: a tank's fuel gauge frozen at empty, its engine blackened by smoke, its turret turned toward a horizon where a plume of fire marks where millions of gallons burned. Around it, men cluster in thin coats, rolling tobacco or sharing a flashlight, debating whether to try for a few more kilometers that morning. One of them is a commander whose name history records for both ability and culpability. He survived that sequence of days. He walked away from halted columns. He was arrested, tried, released, and decades later died in a blaze of a different kind. But what he survived in a more profound sense was the realization that the rules of war had changed. The decisive element was not always the boldest maneuver, but the deepest logistics network. That realization is a different and, in some ways, crueler survival than any single bullet could enact. It is a survival by recognition, by witnessing the mechanized axis of victory being rerouted into denial, by smelling the gasoline that briefly raised hope, and then watching it consumed in a policy choice that was industrially rational but humanly devastating. Peiper's story is not unique in this respect. Countless commanders on both sides learned the same lesson as the front lines of Europe shifted under the weight of production statistics. Today, when museums protect a rusting tiger or when historians show manifest ledgers and pipeline maps, they are curating more than relics. They are preserving evidence of a decisive trend in modern warfare, the ascendancy of logistics. Tanks and guns remain the instruments of combat, but the ability to keep them fed, across oceans, through depots, with the labor of drivers and the planning of staff, has become a primary determinant of victory. If this account has held your attention, and you want to see the documents and manifests that dramatize this arithmetic, we've linked a deep dive in the description with primary sources and recommended readings. Subscribe if you want to follow the series as we examine other moments where industry, supply, and choice intersected to decide battles. In the end, the tragic irony of Hansfeld and Stavelot is that a soldier could survive the bullets and the blasts, yet not survive the realization that his arsenal was in many practical senses obsolete without fuel. He lived with that knowledge. It shaped the rest of his life and lent the Ardennes a lesson that would echo through military thought for generations. Modern war, above all, became a contest of pipes and ports, of factories and fuel, an industrial calculus that made the fate of men and machines hinge less on singular heroics and more on the ability of a nation to keep moving. That is what he survived, not only a campaign, but a new, harsher understanding of how wars are won and lost.